Well, good evening. I'm Dino Dave, and this session is entitled The Ice Age. The Ice Age. I've had a number of requests, people that came to me and wanted me to do a presentation on the Ice Age in recent years. There's been a lot of discussion about climate change in the last decade or so, and folks want to know, was there really an Ice Age? How does it fit in the Bible if there was an Ice Age? So our conversation is going to be about the Ice Age. Let's think back, put on your thinking caps for a minute, to the time on Earth where Noah is just getting off the ark. And of course, all the animals are getting off with him. And the Earth is still a very tumultuous place from this catastrophe, the great Genesis flood. There's still volcanoes going off. The Earth is still shaking and rumbling a little bit. There's landslides happening because some of these sediments that were laid down are still waterlogged, and they're still, muddy, and so they're not completely consolidated, and there's landslides happening. Mountains are still rising up, and it was starting to snow on the higher elevations, probably something that hadn't been seen in the pre-flood world. In the midst of all these residual catastrophes, God makes a promise to Noah. What is God's first promise in the post-flood world? Who remembers? Yes. Okay, the rainbow, and that God will never flood the earth again. It's kind of a trick question. That's the one that everybody remembers. But there actually is a promise before that. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 22, God says, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." Now, why is God making this assurance? Especially this reference here to cold and winter. This is God's first post-flood promise. What's the point of that? I suspect that they were beginning to experience cold and maybe even winter like they had never had experienced before. And this perhaps was causing them to fear that maybe there's another catastrophe that's coming at us. That is going to wipe out civilization. And so God makes this promise. It's going to be maybe an enhanced seasonality in the post-flood world, but there's going to kind of be a regularity to things. It's going to get cold. It's going to get warm again. It's going to be summer, but it's going to have some winter. And so there's this first post-flood promise. Now, when people think about the Ice Age, oftentimes what comes to their mind is something like Antarctica. A complete frozen wasteland. Of course, Antarctica is a whole frozen continent of ice and rock. I've actually been to Antarctica. Here's a picture of Dino Dave and his family going on a trip to Antarctica. Now you might say, Dave, really? Why would you put your family through this? Why would you take your family to Antarctica? Because it's cool. Okay. Some of you guys will get that on the way home. It's cool. But no, it really is. It's a pretty amazing continent. It's a black and white world. Here's a picture of us with a whole bunch of penguins, and even the birds there, they're black and white. But you've got black rocks and lots of ice. In fact, when you are walking on the surface, this icy, snowy surface there in Antarctica, on average, of course there's places where it's much less and much more, on average there's a mile of ice between you and the underlying bedrock. A mile of ice. Think about that. That is a lot. In fact, there is much more water frozen in Antarctica than all the lakes and all the streams and rivers of the world combined. 60% of the Earth's fresh water is held in the Antarctic ice sheets. Antarctica is also the largest desert in the world. Some of the lowest recorded temperatures, minus 129 degrees Fahrenheit. Some of the highest winds ever recorded. So it's a land of extremes. And people think, well, maybe that's what it was like during the Ice Age. Not really. It wasn't like that. Much more habitable than modern Antarctica. So then folks want to know, okay, so if there really was an Ice Age, how does it fit into the Bible? There's some young people that are here in this session today, and you might be thinking in your minds, okay, Ice Age. So where is Manny and Diego and Sid the Sloth and what's that little squirrely guy? Yeah, Scrat. Where are these guys in the genealogies, right? Well, we're not talking about the the cartoon movie, The Ice Age. We're talking about a real historical event called the Ice Age. And there was this time where the glaciers came down through much of where we are now in North America. You couldn't live here because it would have been a icy wasteland. And that is the Ice Age. So we're going to talk about the reality of the Ice Age, cause of the Ice Age, purpose of the Ice Age. We don't always know why God does things that he does, but we have a pretty good idea why God allowed for there to be an Ice Age. And number 4, we'll talk about living in the Ice Age. That'll be fun. We'll talk about some of the things that we know from what it was like to be living in the Ice Age. Okay, let's start with the reality of the Ice Age. The reality of the Ice Age. As recently as the mid-1800s, scientists didn't believe in an Ice Age. In fact, some of these leading secular scientists had taken a real strong stand against the Genesis flood. And the idea of there being an Ice Age was something that was they recoiled from. They didn't want to have a huge worldwide catastrophe. It seemed way too catastrophic. So what was the evidence that helped to change the paradigm? I'm going to give you a handful of key evidences of where there was glacial activity, where there was an Ice Age. And one of these is glacial striations. What on earth is a glacial striation? Well, it's grooves that are kind of like gouged out of the bedrock. And these grooves are scratched into the bedrock as the glaciers expand and move downhill. So boulders are trapped under the glacial ice, and as they're pulled along, pushed along, they scrape the surface down below. Here is some examples of glacial striations. You look at that, you say, man, what would have done that to rock? It looks like King Kong's fingernails went across there or something, but it's solid rock. It's glacial striations. So that's an evidence. Okay, there was the glaciers here, and this area was covered during the Ice Age. And then also glacial drumlins. What's a glacial drumlin? Sounds like it should be in a band somewhere, right? Glacial drumlins. Well, they're these hills. They're really kind of these teardrop-shaped hills, and they're sand and gravel. They're formed from the moving glacier ice. Sometimes they're about a mile long. Here you see a kind of a diagram of a drumlin above and then an actual drumlin down below. But you kind of see that it has this teardrop-type shape, and it's full of glacial debris, glacial till. And along with the striations and the drumlins, we have glacial moraines. What's a glacial moraine? Well, moraines are accumulations of dirt, sand, and rock that are bulldozed up by the front and sometimes the sides of a glacier. Here's a picture of a glacial moraine. And here is a glacier that's melting back. I think this maybe is in Alaska. I'm not sure. But you'll see on the front it has all this debris, this kind of dirt, sand, crushed rock that's pushed up, and even along the sides there, and the glacier is starting to melt back. Now, when we say it melts back, the ice never moves backwards because it's flowing downhill. It's kind of flowing like a stream going downhill as it's growing, but it retreats by melting. And so all the force of the motion is forward, and the moraine is left at the place where the glacier stopped advancing. So that's a pretty good indication, okay, the glaciers went to this point, and helps us see where the Ice Age was and where it stopped. So striations, drumlins, moraines, one more, glacial troughs. What's a glacial trough? Well, this one's perhaps the easiest to understand. There's these big valleys. They're just U-shaped valleys that are carved out by the glacier. The ice started in the north, in the northern hemisphere. It started up at the North Pole and started to expand, moving southward. And on the South Pole, of course, it started expanding, moving northward. But here in the northern hemisphere, close to where we are, you see these lakes, these glacial lakes. And these major depressions are gouged out. They run north to south. Glaciers carved out the Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes of New York, and not too far from us, Lake Champlain in Vermont. Here's a little diagram of how maybe the Great Lakes were carved out by these glaciers, and then eventually just these troughs filled with water. Here's the Finger Lakes from New York. Dino Dave, why do they call them Finger Lakes? Because they look like fingers that are kind of like scraped out there along the topography. The Finger Lakes region, a very beautiful area there of New York State. So here's a little diagram of North America, most of the United States, a little bit of Canada there and Mexico, but you can see that the glaciers went down as far as Missouri and Kansas. All that would have been, ice, and creatures could have maybe lived up close to the edges of that, but not up on those ice sheets. Same thing is going on in the south, all of Antarctica, but even up into South America, New Zealand, you'd have had these glacial glacial activity in these ice sheets. And of course, a lot of that is still there in Antarctica, but it's melted back, especially up in the north. So we talked about the reality of the Ice Age. Let's talk about the cause of the Ice Age. What caused this Ice Age to happen? What caused it to happen? Secular scientists have great difficulty. They struggle to explain how the Ice Age came about. Even more puzzling is how it came to an end. And some of these guys believe in several Ice Ages, which only compounds the problem. It's difficult to explain how Ice Ages come and go. The best that they've got, and it's not really great, but it's the best that they've got, is this theory, this model, called the Milankovitch cycles. The Milankovitch cycles, named after Milankovitch. And he is a scientist really studied out how the Earth goes through some very small changes in its the way it faces the sun. And these slight changes might cause disruptions to our climate. For example, the Earth, of course, is rotating. That's what gives us our day and our night. And it has its axis of rotation. It has a slight tilt as compared to our orbit, our plane of orbit around the sun. So there's a slight tilt. And that tilt, as we go around the sun, is what gives us our seasons. So these things do impact the seasons. And the Earth is spinning kind of like a top. But if you bump a top, it'll still spin, but it might have a slight wobble to it. It's called a precession. And our Earth has a precession, and to completely cycle through this precession, it's going to take around 26,000 years. We see that off on the left side of this graphic, but then also the obliquity of the ecliptic and the orbital eccentricity. These are very slight alterations with how the Earth faces the sun. And it's difficult to think how these slight things could cause a full-on ice age, especially where right now the Earth has ways of balancing itself. Its climate tends to balance out so that extremes are difficult to achieve. This idea of slow and gradual doesn't work well. You're not going to slowly get an ice age because the Earth will balance it out. For example, if things get really warm, well, then maybe you're going to have a lot more evaporation out of the ocean, and there's going to be rain that's going to come over. It's going to cool things out. And so these types of things have ways of balancing out. But here's the difficulty for the secular scientists. If you did start to get an ice age, as that ice sheet began to expand, it would reflect more and more sunlight into outer space, which sends that heat out with it. And so it's just going to keep getting colder and colder and colder, and you kind of have this downward spiral that you're never going to come out of. You're going to remain snowball Earth. Something dramatic would have to happen to reverse that. And so the difficulty of explaining an ice age and then also the difficulty of getting out of an ice age is a major problem. Let me give you a few quotes. Here's the book, Glacial Lake Missoula and the Humongous Flood. Although theories abound, no one really knows what causes ice ages. Here is U.S. News and World Report. Quote, secular scientists have great difficulty explaining an ice age. We've been chewing on this problem for 30 or 40 years. It's a killer. It's embarrassing. Here's another quote. This is from a science journal called Nature, or highly respected journal. 2008, perhaps the longest standing puzzle in the earth sciences is what caused the northern hemisphere ice sheets to come and go. Here's a lady, Ro Kinsler, who's director of the National Center for Science and Literacy at the American Museum of Natural History. She says, quote, scientists are still working to understand what caused ice ages. Scientists are still working to understand what caused ice ages. This was 2018. So the secular scientists just really haven't figured it out. Can I suggest to you that Genesis flood in the Bible elegantly explains the global ice age? In fact, it provides the exact conditions needed for a single short-term ice age after the flood. So the Bible actually explains it really well. The ice age lasted about 700 years. It took about 500 years to build up, 200 years to fall back off, to melt back. So approximately 2350 to 1650 BC was the ice age. And it was caused by two main things. Two main things. We're talking about the cause of the ice age now. First, warm oceans. Warm oceans. So, during the Genesis flood, you have the continents being broken apart. As they're moving apart, these plates are moving apart, you've got a whole lot of new seafloor. This is hot new magma that's coming out, and this is going to warm the oceans probably to something like 80 degrees Fahrenheit. This new ocean crust that's formed during the flood, it's going to make the oceans a lot warmer. Besides, you have the fountains of the Great Deep shooting out, and you just have a lot of volcanic activity. And so you would have had a lot warmer oceans in the post-flood world. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, Dave, you're trying to explain an ice age. You're telling me the oceans are warmer. These things don't compute together in my brain. You need colder to have an ice age, not warmer, right? What you need for an ice age is lots and lots of snow. Well, where are you going to get all that moisture to make all that snow? You see, if it's really, really, really cold, you're not going to have any moisture in the air that's going to be able to turn into rain or snow. And so you need to have warm oceans so you have lots of evaporation. But here's where our second thing comes in. You need to have cold continents so that as all this water is getting evaporated out of the oceans, it's coming over the continents are cold, and it's landing as snow, not as rain. But that's a difficult thing to achieve under normal conditions. Warm oceans and cold continents. But see, you'd have all this volcanic activity during the flood, and these volcanoes, still after the flood, are still going off for some years, centuries even. And they're not just your ooey gooey kind of volcanoes like we have still going on in Hawaii, where they kind of are drooling down and dripping into the ocean. These are the explosive volcanoes, stratovolcanoes. Think Mount St. Helens, boom, blowing your top, all this dust and volcanic ash thrown out into the air. That is going to cause blankets between us and the sunlight, and it's going to make the continents a lot cooler. The stratovolcanoes and all this debris that is being tossed up by them. So you have this combination, lots of evaporation happening out of these warm oceans. You have this precipitation in the form of clouds coming over the continents, but this high-level dust aerosols that were ejected into the stratosphere are reflecting the sunlight. So you have these cold continents, and it's just lots of snow. And as that snow builds up, it compacts into ice, forming ice sheets, eventually forming glaciers, and causing an ice age. Now, this isn't theory. This isn't somebody's speculation. This is observable facts, that some of these explosive volcanic events in the past have caused global cooling. For example, Mount Tambora erupted in 1815, and it was known as the year without a summer. 1883, Krakatoa, this huge volcano, explosive volcano. Global average temperatures dropped by as much as 1.2 degrees centigrade. And then Mount Pinatubo. Now, some of us remember Mount Pinatubo. In 1991, Philippines, that area there, Mount Pinatubo blew its top, and global temperatures dropped by an average of 0.5 degree centigrade. So that's evidence that you got lots of volcanoes going off. It's going to be colder, and you're going to have a lot of snow landing. Mount St. Helens. Everybody remembers Mount St. Helens, right? And pretty significant event, 1980, Mount St. Helens blows its top. What you see here in the red on this graphic is the ash that was laid down as Mount St. Helens blew its top, and all this ash and dust, volcanic particles come out, and so it leaves this dust trail. But then some of the finer particles got shot way up in the atmosphere, literally went around the whole Earth and back again. But we have this major deposition, this layer of ash that was laid down, and it's pretty big. It goes, right across, a few different states there. But what we see down in the rock layers is that at one time in the past, there was much bigger volcanoes, like this Yellowstone one that went, across most of the United States, or some of these other ones that are there. You can see these just huge Huckleberry Ridge tuff, this dark blue one, and this Lava Creek tuff, this light blue one. As you see these massive volcanoes that at one time in Earth's history were active in that region. So you have these spikes, boom, a volcano goes off, another one goes off, another one goes off, and they maybe, take turns, and it keeps this ash cloud up there, replenishes these aerosols for some period of time, and then it's diminishing, it's becoming less until eventually something close to like how it is now. So cooler summers for many years kept snow from melting, and you'd have 500 years, roughly 5 centuries of this to build up, another 200 years for it to come back from its maximum, so about 700 years of the Ice Age. Now here's a quote from Planetary Science, and they say, A total of 25 ash bands and an estimated 2,000 dust bands are preserved in the bird ice cores. These debris bands are estimated to have been deposited on the surface of the ice sheet and testify to much more extensive fallout of volcanic ash in Antarctica during the latter part of the Wisconsin than was originally suspected. So we see these ash layers in the buildup of this snow still there. And we dig these ice cores, drill down and get these ice cores out, and we see these ash layers there in Antarctica. Now, the volcanic aerosols block the sun, cool the continents, layers of snow built up, compacted from the ice, massive glaciers. These are harsh conditions, and they would have caused some creatures to go extinct, and especially large reptiles, like my friends, the dinosaurs. And so probably we have some of the different kinds of large reptiles, dinosaurs, going extinct during this period of the Ice Age. But I must quickly remind you that the Ice Age wasn't all over the world. The Ice Age was, in the northern and the southern hemispheres, but around the tropics it would have remained free of ice. And even in the Middle East, where much of the biblical history is taking place, it would have been very well watered. We read stories about Abraham and Lot coming up to the edge of what is today, the Dead Sea, that area. It's just desert. It's barren there. And it says it was watered like the Garden of Eden. And it's just beautiful, wonderful, lush. Why? Because climatic conditions were very different. Lots of precipitation, and of course it's falling in the form of rain there. But even up closer to the glaciers, even in the northern and southern hemispheres, fuzzy mammals could survive just fine. They could thrive in the Ice Age along the coasts where the warm ocean breezes kept the land free of ice in the summer and continuous rains made for plentiful vegetation. And so these were fine conditions for creatures like this woolly rhinoceros. You had herds of camels and horses roaming in North America, and the woolly rhino lived in Europe. And so this guy thought it was just fine to live there, in the snow. Here's a megatherium, the giant ground sloth. Maybe living in caves, but this huge sloth that existed. And then the most famous Ice Age animal of all, which is the woolly mammoth, right? The woolly mammoth. And you look at these woolly mammoths, and these creatures are just perfectly adapted. These great elephant types are adapted for the Ice Age. Now, I bought a couple of fun artifacts with me today. I have a tooth. This is a genuine tooth. Come take a look at this afterwards. One tooth of a woolly mammoth. Now, if you're going to touch it, please be very careful with it. This is a tooth that has been purchased from Siberia. These things aren't enormously rare, but they're not cheap either. But you see the grinding edge here, and up here is where it would have attached up into the jaw. But that's just one elephant tooth. These things were enormous. And then I have here something that's a bit more rare even still. This is a tusk of a baby woolly rhinoceros, or of a baby woolly mammoth. Now, a full tusk would be as long as one of these pews of an adult. So we have all these herds of woolly mammoths that roamed around Siberia. We find some of their remains in Alaska as well, but just lots of them. And they're amazingly well preserved. So these creatures were preserved in probably some kind of a dust storm. We see a lot of dust in their lungs. And then around them is all this mud, kind of like they got encased in this mud, and they just got frozen in there. And their meat is so well preserved that dogs will still actually eat it. Okay, so we talked about the reality of the Ice Age. We talked about the cause of the Ice Age. Let's transition to this one, the purpose of the Ice Age. Why did God put the whole earth into, the freezer, the deep chill? Well, there was a challenge in the post-flood world, and that was, how do you disperse all the animals? God tells them when they get off the ark, okay, go out, disperse, and replenish the earth. But how do you get to some of these islands? How do you get from where they were in Asia across over into the Americas? This is the difficulty in the post-flood world. In the pre-flood world, it's all one continent, right? And God brings the animal to Noah in order to get out of the way. They climb on the ark, they go to their cages, he kind of points them to where they're going, and it's easy. But in the post-flood world, now these animals are kind of going on their own, and perhaps God is sending them back to somewhere close to where they were, but how can they get there? And so this Ice Age would have taken a lot of water out of the oceans. It would have landed on the continents, built up in the form of these huge ice sheets, and the oceans would have dropped over 200 feet. Now, that would have done some interesting things. Obviously, you'd have the ability to get to some places, perhaps islands offshore, perhaps going down through Papua New Guinea and maybe it's a small swim over to Australia. Here I have a picture of a volcanic island, and you can see there's a little bit of a shallow area there, and maybe with a little bit of sloshing and wading, you could get over to that island. We do know that these lower oceans would have made land bridges, for example, across the Bering Strait. And the inland glaciers would have forced animals not to stay inland, but continue to move along the coast, which would have facilitated their being dispersed from Ararat all to different continents all over the world. So here you see this migration route. And we believe a lot of these animals, they came across the Bering Strait from Asia, there from Siberia, into North America, from North America down through South America, down through Central America, and eventually into South America. So this is what we believe the migration routes were. So God had commanded the earth to be replenished. But what about the people? Did the people obey God and disperse and settle the earth? No. What did they do? They built the Tower of Babel, exactly. They were going to build this Tower of Babel, and they were going to just make a big city here on the plains of Shinar, and they were not about to, disperse. Well, this is an issue, because they're going to miss the opportunity provided by the Ice Age. Once the ice melted, those land bridges would be gone, and so God's command is urgent: disperse and refill the world. And of course, God makes this happen by changing their languages so they can no longer work together cohesively. And so they break out in people groups, some going east, some going north, some going down south towards Africa. And so these people groups begin to disperse. And what are they going to do? They're going to follow the animal migration. They're going to follow the animal routes as they go. So if you look at a textbook of human migration, it's going to look something like this graphic that I'm showing you right now. Now, don't get all upset about the years. This is 26,000 or 40,000 or 50,000 or 70,000. I don't think it took that long. But just look at the routes. This is just coming out of a secular textbook. Look at the routes. And where do they start? If we follow the arrows back, where does the human migration start from? Yeah, that's right, exactly. It starts in the Middle East, but more specifically, it starts near Turkey, right? Like Mount Ararat. Now, these guys don't believe the Bible. But look at where they have the migration starting, right there close to modern-day Turkey, which is the mountains of Ararat. Isn't that cool? And by the way, how do we know this? Well, we see the advance of civilization as it spreads out. So maybe here they're working stone tools. As they're starting to move out, they're starting to get a little more sophisticated, and they're working maybe some early copper tools. Then eventually they get a bronze technology going, maybe eventually iron. And so we see the technology developing as civilization spreads out. And so this map of human migration. Okay, what would it be like to live in the Ice Age? I want to talk about Job's insights, Neanderthal life, and Ötzi, the Iceman. Ötzi, the Iceman. In Genesis chapter 10 and verse 29, we're introduced to a fellow named Jobab. It says, and Ophir and Havilah and Jobab, all these were the sons of Joktan. Now, a number of Bible commentators believe this Jobab is actually the Job who wrote the book of Job, and that the book of Job is the oldest book in our Old Testament. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, what about Genesis? That talks about the beginning. Yes, true, but Genesis was written by Moses, right? And so here you have Noah, and then some generations later, you have Abraham, then eventually Isaac, Jacob, and then they go down into Egypt. Eventually Moses brings them out. But Job is living between Noah and Abraham, so much earlier than Moses. So Job is probably the oldest book we have in the Bible, and he's living during the time of the Ice Age. He's living during the time of the Ice Age. So Jobab is 6 generations down from Noah. Perhaps he's the famous Job that wrote the book. This would have been about the time of the Ice Age. Indeed, we believe Job is the oldest book of the Bible. Henry Morris said this, quote, there are more references to cold, snow, ice, hail, and frost in Job than in any other book of the Bible. A book's vocabulary can be forensic evidence regarding the life conditions and shared experience at the time. Let me give you an illustration. Let's say my friend John and I are living in Alaska. We're Inuits, we're Eskimos, and we're living up there, and we're going to write a book about our life experience. We're going to talk about, what happened this year, what happened that year, and some of the significant events in our community. Are we going to say that summer was as hot as the Sahara Desert? We're not going to say something like that in our book. Why? We've never experienced the Sahara Desert, so we're not going to even make a reference to something like that. And so when we have all these references in the book of Job to snow and ice and hail and frost, it's telling us a little bit about the life conditions, the things that are significant that are going on during the time of Job's life. Let me give you a couple examples. Job 37, verses 9 and 10. From the chambers of the south comes the whirlwind, and cold from the scattering winds of the north. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad waters are frozen. Here's another one, Job 38, verse 22. Hast thou entered in the treasures of the snow, or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail? One more. From whose womb comes the ice, and the frost of heaven, who gives it birth? The waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. So here you have all these references to snow and ice, probably because Job is living up close to the glaciers during the time of the Ice Age. Well, let's talk about the Neanderthals. These are people that lived in what is today Europe, and the Neanderthals. Where do we get that word from? Who came up with this word Neanderthals? Well, it started with a guy named Joachim Neander. Here's a picture of Joachim Neander, and he's a fine fellow. He was a Christian, and he's a German, and he would go down into a particular river valley where he just loved to go and see the handiwork of God, the beautiful trees and the meadows and this wonderful river flowing down through there. And he would sing songs. He was a musician. In fact, we still sing one of Neander's songs today. It goes like this: praise to the Lord the Almighty, the King of, yes, creation. Joachim Neander was a creationist. And he's a musician. Sometimes he would sit in the caves there and he'd compose songs and he'd sing it. And pretty soon he got a bit of a following. Folks would go down in the valley there with him and he would preach and he'd sing. And so he's a little bit of a preacher. Eventually he moved away, but he was so popular that they named the valley after him. And in German, the word for valley is Tal or Thal, depending on how it's pronounced. And so this was Neander's Valley or Neanderthal. So that's where the word comes from. And then sometime later, they were doing some mining in that area, and they began to find in some of these caves bits of skeletons. Now, this is late 1800s, and of course, there's rage of evolution and Darwin's theory, and so right away they say, oh my goodness, maybe these are some very primitive men. They are cavemen. And so we got this word cavemen. And this is the original drawing of the 1908 article that talked about the Neanderthal cavemen. And notice this. They've got just these little bits and pieces that they're working with here. They've got the upper leg and arm and some rib pieces and a bit of skull. So they've got lots of liberty, and they draw this hairy Neanderthal caveman in 1908. And of course, he's sitting there all hunched over, and he's got a rock in one hand, and he's got a club in the other hand. He's going to go and beat to death some animal and eat it raw, and that's the original caveman. Here's an example of a Neanderthal cave, and what's amazing is that once you actually look inside these caves, you've got all kinds of beautiful drawings, like charcoal art. I mean, I couldn't draw horses like this. This is amazing. These guys are not a bunch of boars. They're not half-evolved apes that are doing charcoal drawings like this. Look at here, you've got a cow and a whole bunch of ponies. Just amazing, some of the artwork in some of these caves. We've done analysis of their teeth, and in between their teeth there's bits of salad and mammoth meat, and so they had a very diverse diet. But we discussed in our session earlier on the early Earth that some of these skulls have been analyzed, the skulls and the teeth, and in our creation investigation, we made the comment that these individuals were over 200 years old when they died. Now, can somebody tell me a time on Earth where people were living to 200 years? Before the flood? No, before the flood, they're living in 900 years. When were they living to about 200 years? Yeah, that's right, just after the flood. Abraham lived like 175 years, so it's somewhere between Noah and Abraham, they're living 200 years. So probably these are Japheth's offspring. They're moving north, moving through Europe, and they're living there in the caves because the world is still a tumultuous place. Like I said, earlier, there's this volcanoes going off, and there's earthquakes and stuff sloshing around. Never mind the dangerous animals that are out there. And so Neanderthals are living in caves for protection from danger, not because they were brutes and they had to, because they didn't know how to build a house. No, it's dangerous with these creatures that are out there, and you live in a cave, and it's a safe place. In fact, Job mentions in Job chapter 30, verse 6, people that were forced to live in caves during his days. You see how wonderfully all these things tie together? The archaeology, the Bible, which is God's word, the timing on the ice age, it just all fits together so perfectly here. So there's lots of people in the Bible that lived in caves. Doesn't mean they were brutes or unintelligent. It was a place of protection. Can anybody think of some people in the Bible that lived in caves? Right, yeah, you had Lot and his two daughters during the destruction of Sodom. They went and they lived in a cave for protection. David, another musician who lived in a cave. He was fleeing from King Saul, who was trying to kill him. And then also in 1 Kings 18, a godly man, Obadiah, hid 100 prophets of God in a cave during the persecution under wicked Queen Jezebel. So people have lived in caves all through history. Well, here is the way the Neanderthals are currently exhibited at the Smithsonian Museum. There you see Dino Dave standing next to the Neanderthal exhibit, and here's a guy who looks perfectly normal human being, just a slightly different variation, just different genetics. An article in Newsweek 2023 entitled "What Makes Us Human" says, I quote, "These and other finds, together with advanced technology that's become available to paleontologists within the last decade, have smashed the popular conception of Neanderthals as hairy, primitive, knuckle-dragging cavemen who carried clubs and spoke in grunts. Neanderthals, we now know, were likely more intelligent, sophisticated, and complicated than previously believed." Newsweek 2023. Well, let's talk about Ötzi the Iceman. This is a really fascinating fellow. Ötzi the Iceman. In the 1990s, there were some hikers that were hiking in the Italian Alps, and they start getting up over one of these passes. We're talking way up, 10,530-foot elevation, and you can see down in the valley some hikers just for scale, but this is way up there. They wander off the trail just to see the beauty of the snow and the wonderful day and the views, and all of a sudden, they came across this. The remains of a guy buried in a glacier. Like his body is still frozen into the glacier. And of course, it spooked them, and they called the Italian version of 911, and the authorities come up there, and they tried to use some pickaxes, but they didn't want to hurt this body. And so eventually they got some heat there, and they put up a little tent, and they melted it out, and they were able to extract Ötzi. It's named after the mountains there. Ötzi the Iceman is what they call him, from this place. And as well as able to find a whole lot of his various implements and things there with him. So he's a mummy. What's a mummy? Someone who has children? No, it's a mommy. A mummy is a well-preserved, biological specimen. It doesn't have to be just people, but we think of people typically. But we've got mummies from Egypt because of the dry desert, and of course they put preservatives in them. And we have mummies from Peru that are preserved, very dry climate there, and they're put up in this cold region up in the Andes. And we have mummies, but they're in really bad shape. I actually got to go to Egypt and see some of these mummies of these pharaohs, and they're just disintegrating, and they're falling apart. And this guy, Ötzi, is the world's oldest and best preserved mummy. He's a wet mummy. That is, he's not in a really dry environment where he just very easily crumbles. He actually can be moved a little bit. He's got his hand kind of sticking out there at an angle. But they began to analyze Ötzi the mummy, and he was given extensive analysis, CT scans, X-rays, forensic analysis. It's like this, crime scene investigation. And I actually went there and I was able to see in the Ötzi Museum this mummy that's on display. And they take him out every once in a while and they spray him with, a little water to kind of keep him humid so he doesn't dry out too much. But there in South Tyrol, Italy, they have the Ötzi Museum. And they learned a lot about this guy from all the analysis from this mummy. And they put together a little bit of what they believe he looked like, kind of a reenactment of the Ötzi life based on some of the scars and some of the things. He had tattoos on him and some of this stuff, and they believe he looked something like this fellow here. And in fact, they gleaned so many details that they actually did a movie. I haven't seen the movie. I don't know if it's any good or not, but they did this movie called Iceman about Ötzi's life. But my point is they really thoroughly investigated this guy. Looked through his teeth for what he was eating, pumped his stomach. And then one of the big questions was, how did he die? What happened to him that he died up here? You might immediately think, well, maybe just exposure. He's up there. He's got frozen in the glacier. But this guy was ready to go over this icy pass. And this guy had on this beautiful fur coat. He had on like these leggings that were really, really warm. He had on his snowshoes. And he had all this stuff he was carrying there. He had his beautiful Swiss Army knife, his bow and arrows, and he had a copper axe even. All this stuff. The contents of his backpack totally amazed him, blew away the scientists. This guy's got berries that are rich in vitamins, so he's taking his multivitamin with him. And he's got a coal, it would seem to be, that's contained there so he can start a fire along the way if he needs to. And he knew what he was doing. So how did he die? Well, the people that were investigating his coat found a cut right back behind the shoulder. So they asked for the people doing the x-rays to do an analysis of the scapula, and lo and behold, there was a stone arrowhead in his shoulder. So they solved the puzzle, the crime scene. Ötzi was shot from behind, probably by somebody that he knew. Why do we say that? Because if you killed somebody in those days, maybe in battle or something like this, or in a fight, you'd never leave all the goodies. Why on earth would you leave a copper axe, or their coat, or their little, they had the equivalent of a Swiss Army knife. Now it's a flint knife, but he had his knife there and all these wonderful arrows and stuff like this. And so we have all these things that they weren't taking. Well, probably the reason they weren't taken is because if you show up in town and say, oh, we don't know what happened to Ötzi, he just, but you got all his goodies? What's with that? I mean, maybe you just bumped him off, But this gives us a little window to what it was like in Europe during the time of the Ice Age and the amazing level of technology. His bow was made out of yew wood, Y-E-W. Now, this is the same wood that, so many centuries later, in the days of the great longbowmen of England, they're making bows with yew wood because it's just so great for springing arrows out there. And he has arrows with fletching on them. Some of you guys, you use bow and arrow and you're familiar, but that's these feathers that come off the side that allow the arrow to run straight. And so he's got fletching on his arrows. He's got a quiver for his arrows. Of course, he's got this amazing copper axe. He's got his knife. And what I was really grabbed by were these shoes. These shoes are amazing. You got bearskin lowers, you got deerskin uppers, you've got this mesh there on the inside with grasses weaved in for insulation. It's just amazing technology in these shoes that this guy's got on. And so all this wonderful stuff, and so living during the Ice Age would have been quite comfortable. People lived comfortably in Europe right up to the edge of some of these ice sheets during the time of the Ice Age. Well, let's summarize. In conclusion, the Ice Age was real, backed up by observable scientific evidence. Number two, the Ice Age was caused by the aftereffects of the Genesis flood. Perfectly explains a short, single Ice Age. Number three, the Ice Age was necessary for post-flood dispersal of men and animals to remote locations. And number four, the Ice Age fits well with biblical history. I want to end with just a quick thought. So oftentimes when we think of God's power and God's judgment, we think of fire. Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed by fire, and Of course, the wicked in the end will be thrown into the lake of fire. And when God is finished with this world is going to be burned up and the very elements are going to melt. But God, yes, he's fire. Hebrews says he's a consuming fire. But God also is controlling the cold. And Psalm 147, verse 17 says, he casts forth his ice like morsels. Who can stand before his cold? God controls both. He controls the heat and he controls the ice. And in Revelation, we have this interesting prediction of how ice is going to be a tool of God's judgment. In Revelation 16, verse 21, it says, there fell upon men a great hail out of heaven, and every stone about the weight of a talent. That's about 100 pounds. And men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, for the plague thereof was exceeding great. I would say it's exceeding great. Can you imagine a 100-pound bowling ball of ice falling down out of the sky? I mean, just gathering all that momentum from gravity and wham, just blasting through buildings and construction and going down, embedding itself way into the earth. 100-pound hailstones falling down. God's judgment, God's power over all the elements. We have a great God. And God will judge this world. But can I say that God has provided us a means of escape? It says in his world, and it says in his word, these things are written that you might know you have eternal life. God wants you not to live your life in fear of judgment, but to know that you have eternal life. And just like the Bible so elegantly explains the Ice Age, and it all fits together, and we can trust the Bible. We can put our feet on the authority of God's word, and we can know for sure it's true. So we can be confident that in the world to come, if we have accepted Jesus Christ as our Savior, we can avert God's judgment. Just like Noah on the ark believed God and was saved from the worldwide catastrophe of that time, we can be saved from God's judgment to come. Are you prepared to face your Creator? Are you prepared to stand in judgment someday? You can be. If you trust Jesus Christ as your Savior, you can be confident that you are saved and that you are ready to face your Creator.